everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and I am joined again by Katie Schaefer. We're talking all about the Tommyknockers today, which is a little more science fiction than usual when it comes to Stephen King novels. You know, he tends to have some elements of it, but this one was very much a science fiction novel.
Yes, it was. It had all those Stephen King horror elements, but then instead of like fantasy or dread or all of that, it's just straight sci-fi mixed in.
Or even supernatural, which he tends to do quite a bit too. You know,
Right.
people or kids with powers and that sort of thing. But this was totally alien-esque, but also kind of meta because two of the characters in it are writers. You know, one writes Wild West themed fiction, the other is a poet. So you have these two main characters in Bobby Anderson and Eric Gardner, also goes by Guard, respectively. And I really think, you know, character-wise, he had some good stuff in here. But story-wise, I just wasn't attached to the sci-fi elements nearly as much. I was way more attached to the characters and either their relationship with each other in Bobby and Guard's case, or in the case of Ruth, her relationship sort of just with the town in general. And this novel takes place in Haven, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a city that we haven't heard much about until now. And then it comes up again in later stories from Stephen King.
Yeah, and I think it's really close to Derry. I think they talk about how close it is. And there's a very brief mention of Pennywise as one of the characters drive through. But I agree. I feel like this could have been a really interesting short story. Like if you had given this 200 pages, 250 pages, it could have been captivating. But because it goes for so long, I mean, my book version is over 750 pages. So it gets tedious and bogged down way too often to be consistently entertaining.
Yeah, once it shied away from Bobby and Guard initially, I was like, oh, I don't care about these characters. Can we get back to Bobby and Guard? And that happened until he introduced Ruth. And I was like, okay, I like this character too. But then so many of the characters that he talks about, and honestly, I can't even remember their names because that's how little I cared about these characters. And, you know, I agree with you. It could have been a novella instead, you know, or even a short story if you prefer to call them that. But something about a third, a quarter of the size of this book.
I had this feeling about this book, like as I read it, like the first, let's say, quarter of it, where it's really setting up a whole lot of the story and we're learning who Guard is in particular, because he is such a
mess.
Yes, exactly. Like that man's life is totally fucked at that point when we meet him in the book. But there's a scene in that of him kind of really losing it on his poetry tour where it is painful to read, and not because of what's happening, but because it just goes on and on and on. And it's like, as someone who's read a lot of Stephen King, it's like, I know you can write this in a more succinct and exacting manner. And so this just feels, for lack of a better word, it feels almost masturbatory because it just keeps going. And but then as the book continued, it's like it gets more focused. Like we get Ruth's story, which is, I agree, much more fascinating. And then it feels like the rest of the characters are kind of spread around to give us a picture of what's going on outside of Bobby and Guard and Ruth.
Yeah, so character-wise, you know, Guard is best when he is in the presence of Bobby, at least, or in the same vicinity, you know, once he makes it to Haven.
Yes.
I think that's when things really improve there because you get all of these tidbits about these two characters and their history together. And even though Guard having his, you know, sort of breakdown while he's on his tour and everything, that's interesting. But I totally agree with you. It just went on way too long. And it really felt like this long exposition to introduce us to the idea of the Tommyknockers, because
Right.
it's mentioned when he meets that kid on the beach on 4th of July, I believe it is, because he has fireworks and everything. And they go through the old little tale of the Tommyknockers knocking on the door and everything. And it's like, okay, so this did serve a purpose, but it didn't need to be nearly as long as it was.
Right? It's like 2 paragraphs of 30 pages.
Yeah.
That's the important bit. And like at times it feels like a satirical take on Stephen King. As you're reading it, it's like, this is what someone who was imitating Stephen King would write if they were writing like a faux King story, because it's just so self-indulgent and over the top. And like King has a way with words, and he can turn a phrase on a dime. Like he is very good at crafting these little one-liners at the end of his paragraphs that really make the meaning of the moment sink home. But in this, it's like he tries to do that with every sentence at certain parts. And it's like, okay, man, too much. Too much. You can't do that all the time. You have to limit it and make it really count. And no, the editing, I think, was a big problem for this book.
Yeah, even in an interview with Rolling Stone, Stephen King admitted that this is an awful book. And, you know, I wouldn't say it was completely awful. I mean, I ultimately gave it a 3 out of 5 for lack of Goodreads letting you do half stars. I probably would have gone more the 2.5 rating with it.
I'm right about there.
And I gave him a lot of credit for the character work that I did really enjoy. And even the alien aspect of it, you know, it's one of those things where he wrote the alien characters different enough to where them taking over the town and all of a sudden people were being weird, and you know, that whole thing did make some sense, but it was a little too over the top for me still. I was like, what is going on? This is so wild. And my copy, I believe, was like around the 740 page range, and reading it, I was just like, this book is so long. And, you know, we were planning on doing this podcast earlier than we're doing it now. And it was one of those things where we were both like, we need extra time. So let's put this off for a few more days and get through it. And it was one of those books that just took so much out of me when I was reading it. And a lot of it has to do with the number of characters that I just didn't care for and the major pacing issues. So character-wise, there is some really good stuff to pull out of this, and that's not surprising given that Stephen King does really good character work a lot of the time. But this easily could have been something more along the lines of, you know, Shawshank or The Body in length. So you would have had a more concentrated look at these characters instead of this long overdrawn thing. And, you know, you do feel some sense of triumph once you finish this book, especially with the way it ends. I feel like you're like, oh, okay, well, at least, you know, this ending wasn't absolutely atrocious.
It's satisfying. I feel like it's a satisfying ending to a story that's okay. Yeah. It's aggressively fine. I believe one of my film friends has referred to things. It's very aggressively fine. I feel like this is a book where usually when I'm reading Stephen King, I reach a third to maybe a halfway in and I feel a drive to finish the book. I have to know what happens, even with something as long as, say, It or The Stand or something like that. But with this book, which is not quite that length, but it approaches it, I didn't get that feeling until I would say the last 150 pages. I was like, okay, now I'm invested enough in these characters, almost exclusively Bobby and Guard.
But the fact that it took that long was exhausting.
It is. And it's like, I shouldn't have to wait this long to want to care and know what happens to these people. That should be pretty quickly established. And King kind of falls down on the job with this one, sadly.
Yeah, and we've talked about how his early 80s novels like Cujo and some of those ones were cocaine fueled. And this one was too, because
Yes.
I'm looking at this Rolling Stone interview again here, and I will definitely want you guys to read this because it's pretty interesting. I didn't even know it existed until we started recording this, but he had an 8-year period where he was just fueled by drugs, mostly cocaine.
He was
So
just coked out of his mind all the time.
yeah, and some really good books came out of that. Misery was one of those books too, because that and the Tommyknockers came out in 1987. But for him, even he admitted, it says here, the book is about 700 pages long, and I'm thinking there's probably a good 350-page novel in there, which maybe a little more than you and I would like still, but that's a normal length for a book. It's not
Right.
like reading 2 books back to back just to get one story.
Right. And a torturously slow story. It takes so long. The digging out of that ship, because that's kind of the timeline of the book, very quickly Bobby discovers the ship and she starts digging. And then the end of the book takes place, I don't know, there's maybe 100 pages after they get the ship out that happens. So the majority of the book happens while they're digging. And throughout the whole book, I'm just thinking, all right, dig faster, please. Let's get to the end. Let's get to the point, people. Come on.
Right. I will note that this interview is from 2014, so maybe his feelings have changed slightly on it, but he's usually pretty adamant when he says, oh, there's a few books in my catalog that I don't like because I don't know what I was thinking. And he's been pretty honest and open about that. So when he says things like that, and, in this interview, he also mentions that Lissy's Story is one of his favorite books that he wrote, which I have not read yet because not remotely there. So, that'll be interesting to see, knowing that going into that one. But hearing or reading about what he said regarding the Tommyknockers is interesting because it's kind of exactly how I felt about it.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. I knew going into this that this was, I think I've also heard him talk about this as his least favorite book. Like, he hates it. Of all of the books he's written, which is pretty prodigious at this point. And so I went into it like, okay, if he doesn't like it this much, then it's probably not very good. So I tried to find the good parts in it. And there's some good parts.
Mm-hmm.
But they're so less than
few and far
the
between.
bad. Yeah. But there are a few parts in it where I was reading it and was like, oh, this is really good. This is Stephen King right here. This is The Shining and It and The Stand. And then so much of it is disappointing, we'll say.
Right. We've discussed how we feel about the characters in this, being that we agree that the same 3 characters were interesting, which, I was wondering that while I was reading through this. I was like, I wonder if Katie is feeling the same way I'm feeling about these
Yes.
characters right now. And you don't get as invested in the town really either. Like when you're reading books like It, or I have no idea, The Shining, you're kind of invested in the settings too. With The Shining, you're invested in what's going on in that hotel. And with It, you're invested in what's going on in Derry. But with Haven, because there were so many characters, I was like, wait, what do we really know about this town? It's like there's tidbits in there, but it didn't feel as fully fleshed out as even something like Salem's Lot, where there are just chapters about things going on in the town, which really gives you this sense of what it's like there. And with Haven, so much of the story became about the aliens taking over that you didn't really get that sort of history to the town. You got little bits of it, but given how long the book was, I feel like there should have been a lot more of that. And story-wise, it just felt like it was lacking in that department.
Exactly. I feel like in other books, the location is almost a character, especially in something like The Shining, where the Overlook Hotel and the surrounding grounds are very much a character in that book, like with a malevolent presence all their own. And even in Derry, there's a certain sense that the town has its own will. And with the Tommyknockers, there's a sense that the people of Haven have like are directing things, but it never comes to feel like a whole, like it does in Derry. Like in the few descriptions he talks about when something terrible is happening to one of the kids and people drive by and they just kind of, oh, I'm pretending I don't see this, or they go inside. And there's none of that in Haven. It never feels like a place. It's just all of these isolated characters all interacting. And we know they're geographically close, but it doesn't feel like they're close.
I totally agree with you on that. And, it's kind of hard to know what exactly to say about this story because you have these characters who are interesting and you really want to know more about them, but then this other thing gets in the way with the whole alien invasion, and Bobby finds this spaceship in her backyard and the dog freaks out and other dogs start going crazy. All of these things start happening and you're like, okay, she found a hunk of metal. Something has to be foreign about it, otherworldly, if you will. So that's pretty apparent right off the bat, but then she spirals so quickly, at least within the context of the story, given how long it is. And by the time Guard gets there, she's already kind of lost a ton of weight, lost her mind, and he's trying to figure out what's going on. But his life is such a mess that there's this struggle within Guard, and he's kind of trying to figure out how to go about this, but he doesn't really know what to do because he can't even deal with his own problems right now, let alone trying to juggle his and Bobby's. So you have this tension there, but it's kind of just glossed over in the bigger picture of things. It's like, okay, this is what Bobby's doing. She's going to keep doing it, and there's pretty much no talking her out of it. He does try at least, but fails miserably.
Totally miserably. I think the book could have been better, or at least I would have enjoyed more if we had seen more from Bobby's perspective. Because the big beginning chunk of the book is all from her perspective. And then after that, there's no more from her. And that's it would have been more interesting rather than focusing on how it affected the town, of how it affected Bobby, and have the town in more of the background. If we're not going to make it a concrete character of its own, then we need someone to hold on to as either an antagonist or a protagonist. And personally, I like it most when King kind of makes you consider who's who in the story.
Mm-hmm.
And you could have had a lot of that with this book. You could have had who's the protagonist, Guard or Bobby, and none of that's explored. And so the story, I love sci-fi, and I felt like there was so many interesting sci-fi bits and pieces thrown in here, but they never get elaborated on. We never know, the how or the why or, the extremes to which this can go. It's just kind of thrown in there slapdash. And so therefore it feels boring. And I think that's the biggest sin that this book commits is that it's kind of boring, and it shouldn't be boring.
It feels like he tried to tiptoe the line between these characters and their reality and the alien world, and it just didn't work quite as well. And then you have that whole bit with Bobby's sister who comes to visit, and
right? What was that?
Yeah, we kind of learned to not like the sister just based on what her and Guard in the story have said about her. And at the same time, the sister has a point. Like, hey, your dad died. Maybe you should show up. And, the mom isn't doing so well either, given her age and her fragility. And you're sort of just like, well, yeah, the sister might suck, but she also has a point. And then they just throw her in a shed. And you're like, oh, okay.
And then you're kind of supposed to feel bad for her.
Right.
Because she's being essentially horrifically tortured. And it's like, well, you can't make someone out to be this horrific villain. And this was one of my complaints with the most recent season of Stranger Things, honestly. It's like, you cannot make someone out to be this horrendous villain and then give us so little to go on to forgive them. Like, I need more of a reason for redemption than just that. It has to be more so that I can
And you're talking
believe in
about
it.
Billy, right?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. About Billy. And that was kind of a big thing this book did, is it kind of demonizes characters and then gives really half-hearted reasons for why we should forgive them. And the other part of the book that I was also like, this feels really forced, is the David story of Hilly, who makes his little brother disappear, and his little brother is on that planet or whatever. And so there's this ongoing underlying story of Guard trying to save him and all this. And it's like this,
It's too much.
yeah, like this isn't a fitting redemption story, because I feel like that's what it's supposed to be for Guard. It's supposed to be his redemption, is that he's sacrificing himself to save this kid or whatever. But it doesn't really work. It just feels tacked on.
It's also weird that Guard shot his wife and he still seems to be the most likable character in this.
Right? How do they play that? Like, it's such a background moment for him. And it's like, I feel like we should, as readers, know more about this situation than we do.
He didn't flesh it out nearly enough for my liking. I was like, wait, why do we keep touching on this, but you kind of just skirt around the whole thing at the same time?
Right? Like, we're just supposed to be like, oh, yeah, that's a thing normal men do. They just shoot their wives. Like, you really got to give me a good reason for that. Otherwise, I'm not going to like your character. And
Right.
he never gives you that good reason. Like, he's just too unlikable to be an anti-hero.
Yeah, the story is really all over the place with this one. And, I feel weird saying this because I did give it a 3 out of 5. And like I mentioned earlier, it would have fallen more in the 2.5 range. But the more we talk about it, I might have to like bump it down even more because I'm realizing just how much this story dragged on. And I hate sort of changing ratings after the fact, but sometimes you need to talk it through and be like, yeah, you know what? This wasn't great. And I did notice like a fairly significant drop in like the average Goodreads ratings on this one. And, if people like this book, that's totally fine. It just, for me, was something that I didn't really quite connect with on the same level that I did with something like Misery or It or Pet Cemetery and some of, those big, great books. It is a very long book. There's no doubt about that.
Oh,
My
God,
copy
so
was over
long.
1,100 pages. But by the time I finished it, I felt like every page was worth it. That journey was definitely worth it by the time he gave us the ending that he did. And with this one, even though the ending is a little redeeming, you're kind of like, yeah, but so what?
Too little, too late. Was
Yeah.
kind of how I felt about it. Like, and I will say that the last 200 pages, 150 pages, I was really invested in finding out what happened.
Right.
And I think that speaks to King's skill as a writer to be able to draw you in to want to know, even when the book is so not what you're hoping for. But it just feels like it's a disappointment. Like, you spend a lot of time reading a 700 page plus book, and you want more out of it. And like I said, as someone who reads science fiction, like, it's like there's not enough. There's either not enough horror or not enough sci-fi. Pick one and go with it, because otherwise everything feels watered down.
It's funny, the Dark Half is up next on my list to read, and the paperback copies are roughly the same size. Tommyknockers is a little bigger, but the Dark Half is like 300 fewer pages.
Oh my God.
And, looks can be deceiving when it comes to Stephen King books. One might look really long, but then you open it and it turns out the pages are thicker, clearly, because that's the only explanation that I have for it. And I was like, why was the Tommyknocker so long? And it's only like maybe a quarter of an inch bigger than the Dark Half copy that I have. So it's one of those things where sometimes I'm like, oh, this book, it's long and I don't know if I'll have time to get through it as quickly as I want. But then you open it up and it's like the page count is significantly less than the previous book that was way too long. So that's how I'm
Right?
feeling about my next read after reading this. I was like, well, at least it's shorter.
Right? That's kind of what I'm going to read The Dark Half too, because I've heard it's so good.
Oh, you have not read that one yet.
I haven't yet, and
Okay.
that's one I'm looking forward to. So, but exactly, it's like the bigger page count you get, the lower quality paper they use.
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh, because how intimidating would that be if it was,
Nice
750
thick
pages
pages.
and it's 2 inches thick or 4 inches thick or whatever. It's like,
Yeah.
I'm
Oh
just
yeah,
not gonna
my
read
copy
that.
of it had extremely thin pages.
Right? Right. It's like onion skin paper. Like, oh, I better hold this delicately or it'll shred in front of me.
Yeah, yeah. Or you go to turn the page and the page rips and you're like, "Oh, okay, so that's how this is going to be."
Right? Right. It's like, all right, well, I need scotch tape while I'm reading this to put it all back together.
So since you have not read the book that comes after this, and neither have I, it'll be interesting to see how he sort of bounced back from the Tommyknockers and if he realized at the time, that the Tommyknockers was not great. Because if I'm not mistaken, there is like a year gap shortly after this where he didn't have any movie adaptations, he didn't have any novels, and I think 1988, there wasn't a whole lot going on. So maybe he took some extra time, which, as you and I know, Stephen King just cranks out the books.
Right? He's a professional writer.
Yeah, I am going to double check my spreadsheet on those dates there, though, before we, move on from that topic. But yes, 1987, The Tommyknockers came out. The Running Man
Yep,
adaptation
totally
came
a full
shortly
year.
after that. Yeah. And then nothing in 1988, at least nothing that I was able to find. And then you have the Pet Sematary movie adaptation and then The Dark Half. So there is a year gap there between books, pretty much, November, or a 2 year gap, basically, November 10th of 87 to October 20th of 89. So that's a pretty decent sized break for Stephen King, and whether that was something because
Right.
he was getting his act together from his 8 cocaine filled years or what, I don't know the details on when that happened.
I would guess there was a rehab stint in there, maybe. If not in professional rehab, at least like, I'm just going to focus on not being a drug addict for a while.
Yeah, because he does have then another book in 1990, and he has
One of his
2
best.
in 91. 90 is the Four Past Midnight collection. And then 91, he has The Third Dark Tower and Needful Things. So I don't think there's anything else in 1990. I will double check, though.
Nope, that's what I see too in looking at his bibliography.
Yeah, so he definitely knows how to crank out the books, but he also clearly understood that maybe he needed a little bit of a break. And I wouldn't say he wasn't writing during that time period after the Tommyknockers came out, but
Right.
it really seems like maybe this was the book where he was like, okay, I wrote this thing. They published it because of who he was at
Because
that time.
I wrote it. Right, exactly.
And it seems like that was sort of the conversation that was had, whether with himself, with his wife, with his editor, whoever he had that sort of conversation with. And I can't confirm this, obviously, nor was I even alive at the time. So, no idea if what I am saying is true, but it seems like that is the case because someone like Stephen King doesn't take a break necessarily just for no reason at all. He's still
Right. You
cranking
get up
out the
and you
books.
write every day.
Right.
Yep. That's what you do. It's like the rest of us have our jobs, regardless of if it's a day job, a fast food job, a podcast editing, or whatever you do. You have your thing, you get up, you go, you do it every day. For Stephen King, it's you get up, you write, you be done with it, have your dinner. If you've ever read his On Writing, that's what he says. Is he gets up, he does his thing, he writes for this many hours every day.
Yeah, so we're clearly in agreement here, but I kind of figured we would keep this episode short given how little we enjoyed of it in the bigger picture of things. Out of the 750-ish pages, we maybe like 200 of them, but those 200 were enough for us to like sort of give it that ratings bump. And it's definitely not his finest work, and I'm kind of glad that there's a book that I read and I wasn't instantly like, oh, this is fantastic. It was one of those things where I was like, huh, what is going on? Are we sure this is the story we're going with?
Right? Is this exactly what we're doing? I guess it is.
Yeah. So, any final thoughts from you? Anything you wanted to touch on that we didn't? And obviously, there was so much we didn't talk about, all of the town going after Guard at the end there. That I think might have been one of the most intense moments because you're like, oh, okay, now Guard is really in trouble because everyone in the town is going after him. And even if
Right.
it's not a big town, that's a lot of people.
Yeah, I think.
And he just burns the whole thing down pretty much.
Yep, just kill it all. It's fine. I think it was, there's parts of it that are good, and there's parts of it that are bad, and there's parts of it that are meh. And that's kind of, it is a really good example of what happens when Stephen King is allowed to just run rampant, and why every writer, no matter how good you are, needs a goddamn editor.
The funny thing is, you would think someone would have said something to him, but maybe because of how well known he was by this point, they were sort of just like, okay, we'll let you run with it. And you and I know from past episodes that we've done, like The Stand, that I had the 800-ish page copy and you had the 1200-ish page copy. So
right?
Someone did edit that book.
Right.
And it was still 800 pages. So who knows how long the initial copy of the Tommyknockers was. I mean, he calls it a 700-ish page book in the Rolling Stone interview, but the hardcover copy when it came out was only 588 pages. And I say only as if that's not still a gigantic book. But by Stephen King standards, only 588 pages is a thing. You're like, oh yes, this one is shorter.
Right, exactly. It's like, oh, well, it's not a brick. It's just like...
It's half a brick.
Exactly. It's like you cut a brick in half, that's what we got.
So it is interesting that he is self-aware enough to know that, not my best work. And yet it was still adapted later on. So despite it not being his best work, there's still a story in there. And I have not seen the adaptation yet. I do know that there are some fairly big names in it. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with that story, because concept-wise, there's something there. I just don't think he went in the right direction with it. And, I think last year someone reported that there was going to be a feature film of this instead of just the TV version from 1993.
Yep, I heard that too.
Yeah, and even back in 2013, it looks like someone was going to be producing a new miniseries. So they were going to basically remake kind of the ABC version from the 90s. And it doesn't seem like that came through if they were talking about a feature film in 2018, because I can't imagine we need 3 versions of the Tommyknockers.
No, we don't. We just don't.
But the person who was linked to it, or one of the people linked to the 2018 announcement, was James Wan and It producer Roy Lee. So that would have been more interesting to me.
For sure.
That's a good creative team. And, the announcement from 2013, I don't have any details on that. It just said NBC announced that they were going to be producing a new miniseries, and it probably never happened because there are a lot of Stephen King projects that get announced and we don't end up seeing them come to fruition, which, given how many books he's written and how many short stories he's written, that's not surprising. People are always wanting to dive into Stephen King IP.
Right.
And it doesn't always pan out. Maybe it's because it's been done too many times, but no one is stopping anyone from making Children of the Corn, apparently. So there is that.
Yeah, he's just like, here you go. You want to make it? Give me money. That's fine.
Yeah, give me $1. Dollar, baby.
Yep.
Oh, one other thing I want to make note of is the mentions of the shop in this, because from what I recall, we haven't heard much about the shop since Firestarter. So he brings that organization back, and I find them pretty interesting. Like, not going to lie, I would read a book about the shop. I don't know if that's coming later down the line, but I found them interesting enough and kind of creepy enough in Firestarter to be like, oh, okay, they're bringing this back. So I wonder what's going to happen. And nothing kind of does. So,
Right? It's just dropped in there and then left alone.
And Stephen King will do that. He does all of these little nods. Like you said, Pennywise gets a mention, Derry gets a mention. All of these things get mentioned. There were a lot more mentions in this book than I expected, though, given the style that it was written in and the fact that it was science fiction based instead of more horror supernatural driven.
Yep, that's what I thought. Like when the Pennywise mention comes, I'm like, what? When is this book taking place? It must be one during this year or this year because, it's like I know exactly when Pennywise was in Derry. So I thought that was, and I agree. There's all those other little moments of like linking it with the rest of the Stephen King universe. And it's kind of, but it never, like most of the rest of the book, it never really satisfies with its addition to the story.
Yeah. Well, if you don't have any other final thoughts, I guess that's a wrap on this episode. I know we kept this one a little shorter than maybe a 700 plus page book would normally garner from us as far as a discussion goes. But given how on the same page we are, it was just one of those things where this is a lackluster moment in Stephen King's bibliography for us. And if you like it, wonderful. I am very happy for you because I'm all for people enjoying Stephen King novels.
Right? Exactly. If you like it, awesome. I'm glad you enjoyed it more than I did. I wish I had enjoyed it more. That's how I always feel about Stephen King. Like, I really wish this tickled me in just the way that he was trying to do with this book.
And I will admit that I don't typically care for science fiction quite as much. I do have some novels like The Martian, and it's really hard to classify Star Wars as science fiction for me, even though there are so many other things going on. But I think because of the world building that was done in Star Wars, it feels so much bigger than any one genre. But this really felt rooted in science fiction and alien things. And it's like, if I'm going to enjoy something with aliens, it's probably going to be E.T., if I'm being honest with you.
I can understand that. I can totally understand it. I like my aliens very surreal. And if we don't have that, then I don't know how interested in it I am.
Yeah, and just taking over other people's bodies, I was like, no, they're not.
Right?
They're like aliens, but not really, because they can't exist outside human bodies. I was like, this is weird.
Right, and they can't exist outside this little air bubble. Like, they're just too weak, too vulnerable.
You weaklings.
Yeah, right? Too vulnerable for me to care. It's like, oh, well, just blow a fan at them. It'll be fine.
Yeah. All right. Well, Katie, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this one. I look forward to our next discussion, as always.
Same here. I wouldn't talk about this book with anyone but you because it was real interesting.
It was something.
Exactly. It was something. It was a book. I believe that's what I said to my partner. I was like, well, that was a book, I guess.
Yeah. And not one we will probably reread anytime soon, if ever.
No. Once is good.
Yeah. Well, that wraps up this episode. To all of you listening, you can follow the podcast at Chat Sematary on Twitter and Instagram. We will have a donate link in the show notes if you want to contribute to our Patreon. That will help just support maybe some bonus episodes that, Katie might want to do with me. We might want to discuss some of the nonfiction books that I don't have on the list to get to for this podcast. And, we mentioned on writing in this. So maybe support the podcast if you want a bonus episode on that.
We're down to do it. Just give us some money.
Just a little bit. I don't need a whole lot. And
$1 does it.
Yeah, it really does. There is a $1 tier and there is a $5 tier. So I'm not asking for too much. I'm not doing any $100 tiers or anything too crazy. But as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.